In this second section of the presentation, we provide an introduction to the Proposition 98 formulas and define some of the terminology often used in Proposition 98 discussions. Specialized Proposition 98 vocabulary will appear in green font. Each year, the state calculates the required funding level for K-14 education. Their requirement is known as the minimum guarantee. The calculation is done using the constitutional formulas put in place by Proposition 98. These formulas are known as tests. Each year, one of three formulas, or tests, applies. The Proposition 98 formulas require that two basic conditions are met. The first condition is that a certain percentage of general fund revenues must be spent for K-14 education. Specifically, at least 40%. This is known as Test 1. The second condition is that funding for K-14 education must grow at least as fast as the economy, as measured by per capita personal income, and growth in the number of students. This is known as Test 2. Each year, the minimum funding requirement is based on whichever formula results in the higher, more generous funding level. Now, Proposition 98 was amended in 1990 to allow for a relief valve from the Test 2 requirement in years when the state's general fund is experiencing slow growth. Specifically, if the general fund is growing more slowly than personal income, suggesting a tough year for the general fund, the state may grow prior year funding at the same rate as general fund growth rather than growth in the economy. This is known as Test 3, and it results in a lower funding requirement than Test 2. While this relief can be helpful in difficult years, it cannot bring total K-14 spending below the Test 1 minimum requirement of roughly 40% of all general fund spending. In most years, the general fund grows more quickly than personal income, so historically since 1988, in most years the requirement has been that funding grow with the economy, or Test 2. Now, which formula is used to determine the funding requirement, Test 1, 2, or 3, is triggered automatically depending on how the economy and general fund are growing from year to year. It is not up to the legislature to decide which test it wants to apply or what it wants the resulting requirement to be. Also, the requirement does not lock in when the budget is enacted, but can change as underlying factors like general fund revenues change. Although the formulas apply automatically and the legislature cannot choose what the requirement will be, it can waive the formulas and choose what funding level to provide, either more or less than the formulas call for. Providing less is known as suspension because the legislature suspends the requirement. These options are discussed later in the presentation.
In years where the general fund is growing slowly and Test 3 applies, Proposition 98 requires that we figure out what that funding level would have been had Proposition 98 funding grown with the economy, or Test 2. This hypothetical funding level becomes the long-term funding target. The technical term for the gap between the long-term target and the amount actually provided when Test 3 applies is known as maintenance factor. In future years, the state must provide additional funding for Proposition 98 to catch up to that long-term level. A similar process exists if the legislature decides to suspend Proposition 98 and provide less than the funding requirement. This graphic illustrates how maintenance factor works in a Test 3 year. In this hypothetical example, the dark blue bars represent funding that was actually provided. As shown in the Year 1 column, in a Test 3 year, the Proposition 98 funding level is below what it would have been had the Test 2 formula been used. The difference between the two, which is colored light blue, is the maintenance factor. This reflects the amount of savings the state experiences by taking advantage of the Test 3 relief valve. The Test 2 funding level is established as a long-term target. Over the course of the next several years, the Proposition 98 formulas require that K-14 funding grow at an expedited rate, such that the long-term target is reached and the maintenance factor gap is eliminated. In this way, K-14 funding gets back on track to where it otherwise would have been if it had never dipped below Test 2. However, in the interim years, when the state general fund may be growing relatively slowly, the state does experience savings, and it never has to pay back the funds that schools did not receive in those years. The amount of time it takes to build back up to the long-term target depends on the size of the maintenance factor and on the state general fund revenues growth. It could happen in a few years, as in this example, or it could take a longer period of time. Again, a similar catch-up process takes place in years following a legislative decision to suspend Proposition 98 and provide less than the formulas require. To wrap up this section on Proposition 98 mechanics, we think it's important to emphasize that the formulas may not always lead to the types of results that you might expect. The formulas do incorporate changes in revenues and in personal income, and they are intended to track with the overall economy and the state's general fund resources. However, because they focus only on the year-to-year changes in these factors, not on the state's overall fiscal condition or the amount of general fund resources that the state actually has available, sometimes the results are not always intuitive, and the requirements may not track exactly with the amount of resources that the state has available to spend. Proposition 98 requirements may seem particularly confusing in years following large spikes or dips in state revenues, when intuitively, it may seem like the state should be spending more or less on education than the formulas require.